Yeah, doing well.
Good. Hi, Kevin. I know you're having trouble connecting, but I'm going to get started. So I'm going to share my screen and go over, first of all, a couple of things that I've put onto the page for today's class. We're on week 10 already. Can you believe it? It's crazy. So I've added, carrying on from last week, I've added another link for different designers. This is a designer by the name of Alan Fletcher. He's an English artist, English designer from the sort of 1960s, 70s. He's still working today, I believe. So if you take a look at the archive of some of the work, some great examples in there. And then if you searched his name online, you'll find other examples. So I'll come back to adding some more designers next week. But I want you to focus in this week's class on animation, because I want you to do, as part of your visual identity, I would like you to have a go at trying to create an animated version of your logo. I've put on here, first of all, there's a link to the 12 principles of animation. So earlier in the semester, if you remember, we talked about the principles of design, the elements and principles of design. So that's things like line, shape, color, texture, form of the elements. And then the principles are how you use those kind of ingredients, if you like. So things like contrast, big versus small, light versus dark, that kind of thing. Balance, so symmetrical and asymmetrical. In animation, there's been established these 12 principles of animation. And in these 12 principles, so these are great little videos which encapsulate these 12 principles very nicely in animation. So I've shared with you the playlist for all of these animations. And the first one is squash and stretch. So if you click on it, we'll get a little video. I think it's about 2 minutes long.
Still shooting? Go to artgrid.io and get all the footage you need.
It is dedicated to the 12 principles of animation as described by legendary animators Frank Thomas and Art Johnson. So the first principle is squash and stretch. This is the principle that animated objects will get longer or flatter to emphasize their speed, momentum, weight.
So I'm not going to go through all these videos right now, but those videos are on this link right here, 12 principles of animation. I would highly encourage you, if you're interested in animation at all or motion graphics, to really try to get to grips with understanding these. Have you ever come across these before, Aldrich? You heard of the 12 principles of animation?
Not exactly 12 principles, but I've
You've heard of squash and stretch?
Yeah, I've seen a bunch of different things about animation in art and all that.
Okay, cool. So squash and stretch is basically this idea in animation that when something hits a surface, that it has to squash, right? Which is obviously true in physics. And when it squashes, it also stretches at the same time. So like a ball, for instance, is the most common example of this. As it hits the ground, the vertical space of the ball would squash down because it's hitting the surface. And because it's squashing down, that volume has to go somewhere. So it goes out. So it squashes and stretches at the same time. But that idea of squash and stretch can be used also oftentimes as an exaggeration. So for instance, facial expressions may be squashed and stretched, which doesn't quite happen in the way that you might do in animation, but it kind of exaggerates the expression. Anticipation is in animation is where you're sort of like building up a movement that happens before something happens, which creates animation. Like somebody might step back and pull their arm back before they go ahead and take a punch. And some of these things are sort of like triggers for the audience. So for instance, a character might lift their arm up before they put their hand into the pocket to make it clear that that's happening, rather than it being such a discrete movement. That exaggeration may be, movement may be exaggerated. Staging is sort of how elements are placed on the stage in relationship to each other, what's important on the stage and what's less important. Straight ahead and pose to pose are two approaches to animation. So one of them is where you would animate one frame and then you do the next frame and then you do the next frame and then you do the next frame and so on. That's straight ahead. And this is useful if you're trying to create something which is a very fluid, organic movement, like water or fire or something like that. But for character design, we'd almost always use pose to pose, which is where you would have two keyframes, like where a movement, let's say somebody's jumping, you'd have them on one side, and then you'd have them on the other side of the jump. And then in the middle of that, you'd break it in half and you'd put the pose in between. And then you can break those two in half and put a pose in between that. So going from pose to pose rather than straight ahead is oftentimes useful when you have particularly complicated animations with things like characters. Follow through and overlapping action is like certain elements, like things which are extremities. In this example, I think he has a feather on the hat, which as like, let's say a character comes to a stop, there might be an element on them, like they've got a feather on the hat that bowls forward first and then bounces back again to give a sense that that movement has come to a stop. Slow in and slow out. Slow in and slow out in computer graphics software like Animate, which I'm going to show in a minute, is oftentimes referred to as easing. And it's basically this process whereby something either accelerates or it decelerates. Almost always when something moves, it doesn't move in a continuously the same speed all the time. It almost always has to kind of accelerate and then decelerate in some way. So for instance, if you throw a ball, when you throw it, that ball is going to kind of like do an arc and it will gradually come down. And if it's going up, it's decelerating. So as it goes up into the air, it decelerates. When it gets to the top, it's going to slow down and then it'll start to come back down and it'll accelerate as it goes back down again. So understanding that idea of the slow in, slow out is important to get a good sense of movement, even with things like logos. So not just with characters, but if you have a logo which is animating and you want something to come in to a stop, you don't want it to travel at a certain speed and then just stop. You want it to come in and then come to a rest and maybe it bounces back a little bit, or maybe it comes in and then it comes to a slows down and gradually comes to a stop. Or you might want it to come crashing into something and then come to a complete stop and bounce off of it. But in either case, you're going to want to think about how that thing accelerates and decelerates. Again, with most movement, it doesn't really happen in a straightforward way. It happens oftentimes in arcs. So some examples, if you move your arm, your hand is moving in an arc. Like if I move my arm as I walk, it's moving backwards and forwards in an arc motion. If I throw a ball, the ball will travel in an arc motion. If you swing a sword, that sword will travel in an arc, and so on. So a lot of times in nature, the way that things move would move in that arc type shape. Secondary action. This is something else that's happening in the scene at the same time as the main part of the action and can help to add to the overall animation. Timing refers to like, it sort of goes back to this idea of slow in and slow out to some extent, but it's to do with the relationship of frames to each other. Exaggeration, we've sort of touched about that. And animation, oftentimes you want to exaggerate a movement to really sell it so that people understand, they don't miss it. Solid drawing is to do with making something feel like it has form, three-dimensional form. So this might be true even with your logo, that you want the logo to feel like it spins around in space and it has a sense of form to it, that it has a thickness to it, has a quality to it that's three-dimensional. Maybe not, but that's something which is oftentimes you need to think about in animation. And then appeal is the last one. Appeal is perhaps the most subjective. It's really to do with character design more than anything, but it's making it feel appealing. And that's not necessarily like a nice character. So it could be an evil character also, but it's an interesting character to look at. You can engage with that character and so on. So it's not as relevant, I don't think, to logo design, but you should have an appealing logo. And then the animation can give it more appeal. Particularly like, for instance, with yours, Odrich, where you have the fox. Your fox is really a character, right? We could animate that fox in such a way that it really comes to life and has an appeal to it, has a kind of interesting personality attached to it.
Right. Okay. You mentioned it could be walking in, something like that.
Yeah. So that's a fairly complicated animation to do. But what I would suggest you do if you wanted to do that is you can probably find what are called walk cycles for something similar to a fox. So it might not be exactly, it might be a dog or a wolf or something. But if we did walk cycle for a fox, let's see if we get anything. So you can see here, we've got an example of different positions the fox would want to be in to create a complete walk cycle. There's one of a dog, which is close enough. Here's one where it's sort of running. So if you found something like this, you could base yours off of those different positions. And then, it'd be a matter of taking your drawing and redrawing it. So if you did your drawing of the fox where the body is one piece and the legs are separate and the head's separate, you could almost just move it across, move the position of the legs. You might have to change the shape of the legs a little bit, but with some of them, you could perhaps just move them into position and then duplicate it again, change the legs and so on. And then you've got the whole set of characters.
Sounds good, yeah.
Yep. So I'm going to go over a couple of things relating to creating animations. Over the next couple of weeks, I'll do a couple of different demonstrations for this. I'm going to focus today on the program called Animate, but you could also do this in a software like After Effects, and you could also do it in Photoshop maybe. You could do some of it in Illustrator. Illustrator is not really an animation software, but you could do layers in Illustrator, convert those layers into frames in a program like Animate or Photoshop. They could export layers to Photoshop and then convert them into an animation that way. So have you ever used Animate before, Aldrich? Have you come across this software?
No, I haven't used any of that.
No, okay. What about you, Kevin? Have you ever worked in Animate? Or it used to be called Flash. Have you ever used Flash?
Yeah, I've used Flash before.
Mm-hmm. So was that before it became Animate? Have you used it since it switched?
It was before. No, I haven't.
So it hasn't changed. I mean, it has in some ways changed quite drastically, but the basic structure of it, the way that the software works, hasn't really changed. They basically rebranded the software from Flash because there was too strong of an association with the Flash plugin, which, as you may know, was deprecated a few years back. It's no longer supported by almost all browsers. And so Flash, the software, was the primary program for creating Flash content for the web. Flash content required a Flash plugin. So when Flash, the plugin, sort of disappeared, the software Flash was sort of soiled by that association in many ways. But you can use Animate or you could use Flash to do all sorts of things. So it was used in the early days for creating websites, but you couldn't make a website in that way now as a Flash file. You can create web content in Animate, though. You can create HTML5 content from it, and you can export in various formats. You can export video from it and so on. So I'm going to give you a basic overview of the software and how it works. And I'm going to show you some demonstrations of how we could do some simple logo animation ideas in here. So first of all, on the left-hand side, just like most of the Creative Cloud, it has the tool panel. And this is pretty similar to Photoshop and Illustrator. You've got the selection tool and the sub-selection tool. The sub-selection tool is very much like the direct selection tool in Illustrator. So with this tool, for instance, I could select an individual point and move it. It's also vector-based like Illustrator. So it kind of works in conjunction with Illustrator very well in that regard. Although you could also bring bitmap content made in Photoshop into Animate as well. You can see that you have these various vector-based tools like the rectangle tool and the oval tool and the polygon tool and so on, which are very much like working in Illustrator. So that's the tool panel. Down at the bottom here, we have this panel that if you're not familiar with animation or maybe video content, you won't be very familiar with, but it's the timeline panel. So a lot of what you do will take place in this area. The other panel that you'll use a lot is this one called the properties. So these two panels, or those three panels, I suppose, the tool panel, the timeline, and the properties panel are the three main areas that you would work in this program. This area in the center is called the stage. So anything which is on the stage is visible in the final exported version. But you could have content that's outside of here that animates in, that comes from off stage onto the stage, out from the artboard out here. The other thing that I should point out is this system in Animate called symbols. So you have symbols in Illustrator as well, and you can actually bring symbols from Illustrator into Animate, and they will work as Animate symbols. And the idea of a symbol is it's kind of like a container, and you can contain an animation within a symbol. So let's say, for instance, you have somebody driving a car. You could have an animation of the person in the car. Maybe he's talking away and he's, singing away to himself. You could have that be one animation in a symbol, and then you could place that inside of the car. And then the car itself could be an animation. And on the main timeline, you have that whole car driving along. Maybe the wheel inside the car is a separate animation, which makes it spin. So you have these animations going on inside the symbol of the car. So we've got the main timeline. Then on the main timeline, we've got a car, which is being driven along the timeline. And then inside the car, you've got maybe the wheels that are spinning. And these need to occupy their own timeline. So let me see if I can give you an example. This one, for instance, is an animation I've done for some glitch type. And it's contained within a symbol. The advantage of this is that I can reposition it on the page. The whole animation, that whole glitch animation, which is inside of here, if I double click on it with the selection tool, I can go inside this symbol, and this is the animation. So it's got its own timeline inside of this, not the main timeline, but inside this little symbol. It has its own timeline for that animation, which means that I could have multiple versions of this on the same page. And we can scale them, and we're scaling that whole animation all at once in that way. So understanding the idea of symbols is very important, because a lot of what you do in Animate involves putting things into symbols so that you can do other things with them. You can also copy a symbol from one project and paste it into another project, and then you can bring all of that animation that's inside there along with it as well. On this one, if I double click on it, go inside here, I have an animation for this right here, which you can't see because it's actually going up here. Oh, let me take off edit frames. If we go out of this, this is making these letters bounce. But because it's inside of its own symbol, I could move the position of this. So I could go, actually, I want this to start a little bit lower down. I can drag it. And we're dragging that whole set of timeline down all at the same time. So this particular one is a graphic symbol. There are three types of symbols you can make in Animate. You can make a button, a movie clip symbol, or a graphic symbol. And there are a few differences between them. So the graphic symbol has a few advantages. One of them is that if I scrub through here, you can see the animation taking place inside that symbol. Whereas if this was a movie clip symbol, even though there's animation in there, I wouldn't be able to see that animation taking place. If I tested the movie, it's still animating, but I can't see it when I just scrub across the timeline. The other advantage of having it set as a graphic symbol is that we could have it simply play once. So by default, it's going to play over and over and over again. It's going to keep looping, as it's called. So this first option, the default option, is play graphic on a loop, which means it's going to continue to go around and continue to bounce. Once it's done it once, it'll keep doing it over and over again, as long as this timeline lasts, actually. And then it'll start again at the beginning of the timeline again. But if I was to set this so that it only plays once, once it's done its bounce once, it'll just stop there then. It'll start bouncing again once it gets to the end of the timeline, but it's not repeating itself within there. So if we go up here, we've got modify convert to symbol. You could convert something you've already created into a symbol. You can also insert a new symbol. And then all of these elements are stored within what's referred to as the library. So the library is here somewhere. Here it is. So in the library, I have these various symbols. I've got symbol 1, O, F, C2, C1, and then ball. Those are my different symbols. If I double click on it, I can go inside that symbol and I could modify it inside here. I can also duplicate symbols and make changes to the duplicate so that we've got something which is similar to the before, and we could use it to swap it out. On this one, I've created like a spinning disc for the letter O to be formed, and then I have a ball that bounces in. So the bounce on this, I didn't quite get it right, but I was trying to do this afternoon and didn't have enough time to spin on it. But the basic idea is that what I'm doing is as it comes in, at a certain point, I have it go a little bit further than I want it to end up. And then I bring it back a little bit further. And then I take it a little bit further again. And then I bring it back again. So that it's gradually coming to a bouncing stop rather than it just coming to a thud. I've also, within this, which is called a tween is where you go from one place to another. So in this case, this is that orange ball that flies in. So as you watch it, it's coming from here. This point right here, this keyframe, is where the position is at this point. This keyframe right here is where the position is at this point. Also notice that at this point, the object is invisible. I have the alpha, which is the transparency, lowered to 0. By the time it gets to here, it's got a little bit more transparency on it now. And then gradually it becomes more transparent as we go through this whole set of steps. Hey, no. So I'm going to start off with a fairly simple one. And then we'll go into ones that are a little bit more complicated. So for this glitch type one, for instance, I'm doing basically what's referred to as a frame by frame animation. So I'm doing one frame, and then I'm either making a duplicate of it or I'm making an empty frame and then copying and pasting it. So I'll show you what I mean. When I started this, I started off with a new document. I set it to a square at 600 by 600. We could always change this afterwards if we needed to. I'm going to hit create. The frame rate, by the way, let me do that one more time. The frame rate, by the way, is set to 30 by default. You could change that if you wanted. So, for instance, the standard for animation actually is usually 24. Underneath that, it says platform type. ActionScript 3.0 is the coding language for animate, what used to be Flash. You could also do it in HTML5 if you want. And you can convert between those two systems. But I'm going to use ActionScript 3 just because it gives me more potential in terms of what I can do with it. And most likely I would export this out as a piece of video. So I'm going to hit create. And then I'm going to add a piece of type in here by just typing. But you might copy something from Illustrator, like your logo, for instance, as a starting point. So you can copy and paste from Illustrator pretty easily. As I said, they're both vector-based software, so it works pretty well together. So when I make this piece of type, it's inside of a text box. We can adjust it in many of the ways that you could adjust type in Illustrator. We can go over to here, you've got the character panel, we can choose a different font, we can change the size of the font, we can adjust this tracking, which is the space between letters. So I could open that up a little bit if I wanted to and have this be a more letter spaced version of that. Ultimately, though, I want to break these letters apart so they become raw shapes. So to break something apart, I'd go to Modify, Break Apart. This is a little bit like doing Create Outlines in Illustrator or Expand in Illustrator. It's changing it now. You'll notice now these are all separate individual letters. Sometimes I might, at this point, choose Distribute to Layers. So I have each of those letters on a separate layer. I'll come back to that later on, but for right now, I'm going to break them apart again. Command B. So now these are raw shapes. The way you see them with those little tiny white dots all over means that it's a raw shape. When it's selected, that's what a raw shape looks like. So from here, I'm going to add another frame. In the timeline, I can adjust how big I see my timeline. So if I zoom in, you can see that the frames become much bigger. Here, they're much smaller, so I can see more of the timeline. Here I can see less of the timeline, but I'm zoomed in so I can see each individual frame more clearly. I want to do a frame. I'm going to animate this on 2s. This is pretty normal in animation. What that means is that this frame here is just going to repeat. It means I don't have to do as many drawings, but I'll get something which still should work pretty good. I might want to do frame by frame animation if, I might want to animate on ones, I should say, where I have one frame and then another frame next to each other if we have some very, very delicate, fast movements. But usually animating on 2s is perfectly okay. So if I add a new keyframe here, so this, by the way, with the black dot in it, is a keyframe. If I do Insert Keyframe here, you'll see that I've got another black dot there. And it's black because I've got this type on it. If I'd made an empty keyframe, it would look like this. But because it has something on it, it's filled with black. Now what I can do is I can go in and select parts of this. One of the nice things about Animate, and I sometimes use this actually for drawing purposes and then take it into Illustrator, but I could take parts of the letter and just select it like that. And then I can move it. So by just simply dragging over the letter, I can select little portions of it and then move it apart. I'm using the arrows on the keyboard to nudge the letters into different positions. So basically the idea here is that the letter form is sort of breaking apart and then coming back together again. It's sort of flickering. I'm going to choose Insert Blank Keyframe this time. I'm going to make a copy of the original one which hasn't been destroyed, and I'm going to paste it in exactly the same position. So just like in Illustrator, you can paste in place by doing Shift Command V. So if I was to scrub back, you can see that those are in exactly the same position. And then I'm going to do the same thing again. So I'm going to select some of these random shapes and offset them. I have to stop for 1 second, okay? My wife just came back and I haven't seen her in hours, and I have to give her a big kiss. Give me 1 second. Oh, sorry. I'll be done soon. Sorry about that. All right, so I can continue going through here and chopping up bits of the letter forms. And then I could make another one, insert keyframe. So it's that process repeated basically, but I might add colors into it. So the other one that I'd done, this glitch one, on some of the frames, I'd started adding little bits of color into it as well. But obviously you could do really whatever your imagination can think up. You know, on some of those, I'm just selecting bits and moving them, but you could also add little additional bits like little lines or little glitchy pixels into there, or maybe even like little bits of images start poking into the lettering or something like that, or maybe pixels start appearing and disappearing and so on. But this is just to give you an idea of how simple we can take, we can make an animation, we can make something move by simply duplicating the layer, or sorry, duplicating the frame, by adding an additional frame. So remember that on the timeline here, when I add a new frame, or sorry, to be more specific, when I insert a new keyframe. So a keyframe is where there's a change that takes place. That's the idea of a keyframe. So I can then change something on here. There is a difference between a keyframe and a regular frame. So these are all frames here. None of them have dots on them. So this would just stay where it is. So it will just continue to be on the timeline. The time will continue to play. So if you want something to be static, it can just stay there now. Now I've done this on the main timeline, and it would really be better if it was inside of a symbol. So if I'd made this on the time, oh, actually I did do it on the main timeline, sorry. So I did put this inside here. Oh, this one I did. This one I did it on the main timeline. So if I wanted this to be inside of a symbol, what I can do is I can select all of these frames, control click or right click if you're on a PC. I would choose cut frames, which is a bit scary because you now got rid of everything you just spent a little bit of time working on. And then I would add a rectangle. This really doesn't matter what it is. It could be a circle, it could be a rectangle, you just draw a shape. I just want something that I can convert into a symbol. And then I would choose modify, convert to symbol, and I'll call this, say, glitch. I'm going to choose graphic symbol for this and then press OK. Next thing I'm going to do is to go inside of a symbol, I double click on it with the black arrow. You'll see it here at the top. It says scene 1. So that's our main timeline. And on that main timeline, we have a symbol called glitch, and we're now inside of it. I don't really need this black rectangle. I just needed that to make something into a symbol. But now I can paste the frames that I had on the main timeline by choosing paste frames. And if you had layers, by the way, the layers would come in as well. So you could copy all of the frames. It could be a very, very complicated timeline with many minutes of animation. You could copy the whole thing and put it into a symbol if you wanted to. Here it's off the page, but I can always move this symbol now. If I go outside the symbol, I can move it to wherever I want. So not by, make sure I'm on that keyframe when I do it, because you may have noticed when I first did this, my playhead, which is this blue line, was over here. So if I move it here, you'll notice that it creates a new keyframe. I don't want to do that because now it's jumping to that position. I wanted it to be in a new position. So I'm going to take this keyframe and then move this over to here. I might add some additional time on the timeline, insert a frame. This animation right now is just going to loop over and over and over and over again. If I wanted it to play once, I can select it on the main timeline right here and choose to play once right here. So this is in the properties panel. You can see this first one under looping says play graphic in loop. This next one says play graphic once. If I click on that and play it, it'll animate. So this is a very short animation. It didn't animate there for a second. And then this rest of this is just static. On this one, I was using some of the motion presets. So if I go to window, and I always have a hard time finding this, motion presets, here we go. So I'm going to make a new file. I would need to have a symbol that I want to animate. So to keep it simple for right now, I'll just draw a circle. And then I'm going to go to modify, convert to symbol. So the idea of these motion presets is that it will automatically set up an animation based off of certain parameters. So if I did large bounce, for instance, it's going to do that. It shows you a little preview of what it would look like. If I did multiple bounce, it would do this. So if I applied that, you can see that what it's done is it's set up this timeline right here. I'm going to make my timeline smaller so you can see it. It's set up this timeline here with my symbol comes down to here, and then it squashes, then it goes back up, then it squashes, then it goes back up, and so on. You can see this is that idea of the squash and stretch. So when it gets to this point, it's squashed this way and stretched out this way to exaggerate the idea of the way that a ball would fall. Now, the other thing is you'll notice that there's a keyframe either side. This is because we don't want the squash and stretch to start from here. We want it to be basically a round ball almost to the end. And then right at the end, it'll squash and then stretch, and then it'll come back to being a circle again. And then here, it doesn't go quite up as high as it was before, because if you think about a ball, it bounces, and then it's losing momentum, right? So then we've got a second bounce, which is a bit smaller, a third bounce, which is even smaller, and so on. So that's an easy way for you to set up something to bounce rather than having to do it yourself manually. But you could do it yourself manually by creating tweens. Let me talk about the difference between the different types of tweens that we have in Animate. So the first one I'm going to show you is what's called a shape tween. A shape tween is based off of a raw shape, or between two raw shapes, I should say. So let's say I have one here, and I go down the timeline to say here, and create another blank keyframe. And then I make another shape. If I was to then do a shape tween, it would tween that shape from that position to that position. It would also tween the color, by the way. So if this first shape here, let's make it a flat color to make it easier. And then I'll change this one to a different flat color. So now, not only is it tweening the shape, but it's also tweening the color. This is a little bit like what the blend tools does in Illustrator, the way that it works. Very similar kind of concept, except that obviously it's making an animation for us. So if we animate that, it would do this. Sometimes when you animate shapes like this, they're not quite sure where to go. So you can control the position. That gets a little bit advanced. You can use what are called what's called shape hinting. So you can add a shape hint to specify this point will animate to this point and so on. So I'm not going to go into that in detail, but just in case you want to try with the shape tool and it's giving you weird blends, we can talk about fixing that afterwards using shape hinting. So that's a shape tween. A shape tween, remember, is going from one shape to another shape, and it's kind of creating an animation from those two shapes. And it's also animating a blend between colors. I'm going to make another layer, and then I'm going to draw a shape. I'm going to choose modify, convert to symbol, and I'm going to make it a graphic symbol, and we'll just call this square. So if you want to move an object from one place to another, let's put this down here at the end. So if I want to move this square, I can insert another keyframe here. So now I have the square in both of these positions. And I've made this into a graphic symbol called square. So that means I can use a classic tween. I wouldn't be able to use a shape tween. Notice how this is grayed out. This is because these objects that are on the keyframes are symbols. So for a symbol, you can either use a motion tween or you can use a classic tween. So the classic tween in Flash was just called, I should think it was called a motion tween. I can't remember now. But this new one was supposedly replaces the classic tween. But I actually prefer the classic tween in a lot of situations. It's easier to control. The motion tween does give us some advantages, which I can talk about. But with the classic tween, this purple color represents it. This orange color tells me that this is a shape tween. So on this one now, if I was to move this object somewhere else, we've now made this animate. The other things you could do with a symbol is you could rotate it. So now it's rotating and moving. And you could also scale it. But it has to go from one instance of a symbol to another instance of the same symbol when you're creating a tween. So this is the same symbol here. It's the same symbol here. I've just modified it as a symbol. So I've scaled it, rotated it, and so on, moved its position. I could also affect its color. So for instance, I could choose a tint. I could set the tint to 100%. Now it's going to blue. You can see that it'll blend that animation with the color as well. So even though it's the same object, we could do quite a lot to that one symbol to have it change and then animate between those changes. I'm going to just copy this symbol and put it on another layer. So this one I'm going to call classic. So this is a classic tween. This is a shape tween. And then this one's going to be a motion tween. So with the motion tween, again, I'll paste this into position. If I then just right click here and choose create motion tween, anywhere down this timeline, I could go. I could then just move this to add a new keyframe. And you can see that it shows me the animation. It actually showing me the frames as well. That number of dots is the number of frames I have here. But I can also take that and I can bend it. And if I click with the direct selection tool on the corners here, I can grab it, come on. I can get these handles and we can then also readjust the position of those curves more intensely. So this is one of the advantages of motion tween is we can do stuff like that, where it's following a path. I can also put orient to path right here, so that as it goes along that path, it's also rotating along the path. The other thing on any of these that I haven't done, I mentioned that one of the principles was slow in, slow out, the idea of easing, the way things accelerate and decelerate. And so on the shape tween, if I put my cursor here, I can change the ease there. So this shape, let me see, this is this layer here. So right now, if I animate that layer, this is moving at a constant rate. All of them are actually. They're moving at the same rate all the way along the path. So on this shape one, what I can do is change this so that it's accelerating in and out. So I'm going to click on this classic ease, and then I'm going to choose ease in out. I'll choose a pretty exaggerated one so that you can kind of see this pretty easily. So now when I play this one, this is this one at the bottom here. It accelerates and then it decelerates. Actually, this is this one, sorry. It accelerates and then it decelerates. Do you see that? So it's not traveling at the same rate the whole time. It has more of a sense of and then the same with this one up here. If I select this one and double click on it, we then have this mess right here where we could add the easing into it. So we could choose add ease, and I could choose simple ease, slow in. I could do stop start. Let's try that again. So I'll do a medium stop start. You can see how that kind of changes the speed at which that's traveling. And then with the other one, which is the classic tween, again, just kind of like with the shape tween, I go over to the properties and we can click on classic ease and I can choose to have it ease in. So this will mean it is accelerating. So this is the one at the bottom now. I should maybe move this down so it makes more sense. But if you look at this layer, this is this one at the bottom right here. So I've made this so that it accelerates more. It starts off really slow and then it gradually gets faster. Do you see that? If you were doing that as a frame by frame animation, the frames which are at the beginning where it's going really, really slowly are going to be very close together. The movement is going to be very slight because it's not moving very far. So if you were thinking of it as like a set of drawings, I'll do this in Illustrator. Let's say you were doing a ball that's falling down and it was accelerating. The first one might be here. I'll do this like this so you can see it better. If we do the first one like this, the second one might be a very slight movement. The next one might be a little bit more still. The next one might be much further. The next one might be further still. The next one might be further still. Basically, we're doubling it each time. And that will give you the sense of it accelerating. The faster the acceleration, the more that change takes place, right? But that's the basic idea. And then the deceleration is basically that reversed. So the deceleration would be going like that, you know. So that in essence is easing. Here it's going very, very slowly and gradually picking up speed. As it picks up speed, the space between the ball has to be further for each frame. So for every fraction of a second, if it's playing at 24 frames per second, the space in time between this frame and this frame is 1/24 of a second. So if it's only moving a very small distance, it's going very slowly, but it's moving a long distance over 24th of a second, it's going very fast. And so the more space we get, the faster it's gradually getting. So that's the idea of acceleration. Do you all follow that so far? So just to recap this section, I was talking about the various tweens. We've got one which is called a shape tween. So this is this one right here, which is in orange. This would allow you to go from one shape to another shape. This is this one in the middle. And also from color to color. And to make a shape tween, it has to be with a raw shape. So if I'm on this layer and I have the selection tool selected and I select it, you can see that it's made of those little dots. That tells me that it's a raw shape. Although I would know that this is a raw shape because you couldn't make a shape tween with it if it wasn't a raw shape. It just doesn't give you the opportunity to do it. If you're going to make a classic tween or a motion tween, they need to be with two instances of the same symbol. So you're going from one position of the symbol to another position of the symbol. Does that make sense to you all?
Yeah, that does.
I've got another demonstration which is set up, which is frame by frame animation. So this is a little bit like the glitch idea, except that instead of starting with something and like a piece of type and then editing it, I'm just simply drawing. And in this, it shows you the use of onion skinning. So I'll take it off for right now. All I'm doing is having a line move to give you this idea, but it could be any animation that you're doing. It could be a character illustration. You're taking something from one place and you're moving it somewhere else. Obviously, the more complicated that drawing is, the more difficult it is to move from frame to frame. Again, you'd have the same kind of idea of like acceleration and deceleration. So maybe this line at certain points is really close together because it's moving slowly. At another point, it speeds up and you have a lot of space between it. Again, I'm animating on twos. So if I zoom in on this, you can see that there's an empty frame in between each one. It's not actually empty. It's a repetition of the first one. So it just leaves that. When you put a blank frame, like if I was to add a frame here, not a keyframe, but a frame, it just continues that graphic. If I was to put a frame here, it would continue that graphic to there. So here I'd select the next frame, insert a keyframe, and then so that I can see what I'm doing, actually, sorry, here I would insert a blank keyframe because I want to start drawing again. If I put onion skinning on, you can see the previous frame. If you drag this out, you can see more than the last frame. It also uses a color coding and a gradual tinting of it, so you can see which frames come first and which come second. So this more intense purplish color is the one which is the latest. You can also show frames that come after. If I had this frame selected, you can see that I can also see these frames. This one's indicated in the green, same as this green here. This turns to blue on this side. So if I was to add to this, I'm using this tool, which is called the fluid brush tool. I kind of like the way this moves. I actually don't have my tablet set up, so this is a little bit awkward, but I'm going to just draw through here. This isn't the color I want. Let me get this color again. So I could just draw along here. I want to have it overlap a little bit. And again, that idea of how far it overlaps depends on the speed. So if it was going very fast, there might not be any overlap or very slight overlap where it starts here because it's going so fast that you barely see that change. If it's going really slowly, I might have it start it right the way back here and basically repeat this. And then I would continue. So I'd add another frame. And you can see that with the onion skinning, I can get a sense of where that's going. I've added a keyframe again by mistake, but if I did add a keyframe by mistake, I can always just delete what's on there. I don't need that bit. So this is the previous frame. I want to start somewhere into that and then have it continue around. So if I play this, this is what I've got so far. There's only a few frames there. If I wanted to slow it down, I could have this animate on threes. I would insert a frame in between each one. This one I'm going to insert 2 frames because it's at the end. So this will slow that whole animation down a little bit. If I added more frames, it would slow it down more. Now, the more frames I have where it's static like this, obviously the more jittery it becomes. So if I continue to add blank frames in between, I might actually want to go in and do that idea of pose to pose, where we do one in between that connects those together. So it would make it more fluid. So that's another approach. I'm going to show you one other thing, which comes taking something from Illustrator and then putting it into Animate as a series of layers. So I'd started something here. I hadn't got very far and then the class was ready. But I have a few frames here. Basically what I've done in terms of the setup is that on the first layer, I've got a starting object. And then I have a background color, which I've locked. This background has a transparency of 50%. And I've put a little color in it just because it's a little bit easier to remind myself that there's a background color there that I need to delete later on. The 50% is to simulate the onion skin effect. So you can see that as I draw this, I can see the frames underneath. So this is that frame. And then this is the frame underneath that. And then that's the frame underneath that. That's the frame underneath that and so on. So if I go up here, you can kind of get a sense of what's happening in terms of the animation. with this as well, I could always duplicate some of these frames. If I take these frames and just drag them like that to the new layer icon, all of these are then copies of those last set. I can also select frames and reverse their order. So I might select these new ones and then go reverse order. And then let's see what we've got. I don't want the background anymore. So making sure that they're all unlocked by doing Option Command 2, Object, Unlock All, Option Command 2, or Alt Command 2 if you're on a PC. And then select all of the backgrounds and delete them. Now I've got these different layers. These are going to be frames. So if I do File, Save As, so I'm just going to save it first of all as an Illustrator file. Then I'm going to go back to Animate. I'll create a new file. Let's see what size this one is. So this one I have at 1080 by 1080. So I'm going to just change this here to 1080 by 1080. Again, I'll leave all this the same and hit create. And then I'm going to begin by creating a symbol for this to go inside. So I'll draw a square, select it, choose modify, convert to symbol, and I'm going to call this heart. Double click to go inside it, delete the square because I don't need this anymore. I just needed the container, remember. So I'm inside the symbol called heart, which right now doesn't have anything in it. And I'm going to go to File, Import, Import to Stage. Then I'll find that Illustrator file that I exported. I thought I put it into here, but I didn't see it. Oh, there it is. So I choose the Illustrator file. In here, I can see all of my layers. So if I click here, I've got all the layers I need visible. Okay, great. And I want to make these into frames, not layers. So I could import them as layers. And certain situations in Illustrator, you may want to do that. But in this case, I want to import them as keyframes. So if I do that and hit import, now I've got those different frames. Between each one, I want to add an additional frame. So if I select each frame and do F5, F5 is the keyboard shortcut to add a frame, it'll just add one additional frame after the one that's already there. And that'll go out of here. Now I've got my symbol, I can move it into place. And then on the main timeline right now, if I was to play it, I have nothing because there's no time on the timeline. But if I was to go out to, say, here, let's make my timeline a little bit smaller. So I'll drag this back down. Let's go out to 2 seconds, insert a frame, and then test what we've got. So this is what I've made. Not very successful, to be honest with you. But that's the basic idea. We could create a drawing on one layer. So I'll make another one the same size. You want to have the rectangle in the background, which has some kind of color on, so you can see it's there. So I usually keep this pretty low, but you might even want a background color. But give it some kind of color so you can see it. And then lower the opacity to 50%. Remember that 50% is so that we can see the onion skin effect, where you see the frame that's before, and then lock this color so you can't move it. And then everything happens in the layers. So in the layers now, I want to add something else to this layer. So let's say I did a drawing. something like this. And then you would duplicate this layer. And then on the duplicate, you could make some kind of a change. So for instance, I might take the eyes and just move them this way a little bit. And then I'll take the nose and kind of straighten it slightly. And we'll also adjust the angle of his mouth a little bit. So then we have an animation that we've created like that. So obviously we could continue. You lock these layers, duplicate this one, lock this one, make some more changes to it, duplicate it, make some more changes to it, duplicate it, make some more changes, so on. And so that's the basic process of this sort of frame by frame animation in Illustrator. The beauty of doing this is that you have the ability to use Illustrator that you may already know better than you know Animate to draw with. And then you can import those vector-based illustrations into Animate and have it animate as frame by frame animation from there. And we can control this a little bit more. Like here, I don't have the extra frames in between, but I could go in here and add those extra frames. You don't really have the ability to do that very easily in Illustrator, although you could just duplicate every layer. But I can very easily adjust the frame settings here. And of course, because it's now a symbol, we could incorporate this animation in with a whole bunch of other ones. So for instance, we could have this one here, duplicate it, scale it bigger, go to the properties, change the color effect to tint, change it to red maybe. I accidentally made a keyframe in the wrong place. So let's put this one. I'm going to take this one here and I'm going to cut it and I'm going to clear this keyframe. So I didn't really want to add a keyframe there. I do this all the time. So I'm going to put clear keyframe and I'm going to clear it again here, clear this keyframe, and I'll make a new layer and put this heart on there. And then this one, I'm also going to scale a little bit smaller. So now we have that. I'm not sure where that big jumping one comes from. Oh, it's because there's an extra frame there. So if I remove that frame, I keep adding extra frames by mistake. Okay, so now they should be equal to each other. So I realize that this is kind of asking a lot to suddenly start a whole new process, another program in the middle of the semester. We've been looking at Photoshop and Illustrator and InDesign. Now I'm giving you another program to think about. And but I do think that it's relatively simple once you get into it. It seems complicated, I think, at first, but it's actually relatively simple. I would suggest that to begin with, you just come up with an idea of what you want to animate, and then we can talk about processes of how you could go about doing that. So if you have a particular idea that you want to do, like maybe you want to make something spin, or maybe you want to make something grow out of something, we can look at the best ways of doing that. You can also use masking layers in Animate. So you could have something that is hidden and then comes out, animates out of a hole or something. There's lots of little tricks that we can do to create interesting effects. So we've been on for an hour. I think I'm going to leave it at that. I just wanted to remind you of a couple of things. So take a look at the 12 principles of animation. I think the most important ones to begin with is that idea of easing, slow in, slow out, and also the idea of squash and stretch is a very important one to try and understand, and the idea of arcs, the way that things move in arcs. But if you have chance, each of these videos is about 2 minutes or so, 3 minutes maybe. So it's a good idea just to go through and sort of check through them if you have chance. And then I've put a few examples. So there's one here, examples of animated logos. This is one on Behance. So if you scroll down here, there's quite a few different examples. Like the Google ones are always really great. This is one that's looks like it's for YouTube, Twitter, Chrome. So take a look at those. And then there's another set of examples here, which is just a video that sort of one after the other. But it'll give you some inspiration anyway as to how you could go about maybe approaching doing your logo as an animated logo. All right. Do you have any questions for me before I take off?
No questions for me, John.
Okay, Kevin. All right, I'm going to take off. For this week, I'm not going to do the lab afterwards, but if you have questions for me regarding your projects and you want to meet before Thursday, I'm happy to meet with you individually, okay?
Okay.
All right,
Sounds good.
see you for now. I'll see you on
Thank you.
Thursday. Bye, guys.
Bye.
All right. Bye.